Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and I've got the bad idea for you guys this week. We're going to be talking about Night Trap.
That sounds like a place with lots of illicit things happening.
Well, some people would have you believe that that's not so far from the truth, but we're going to go back and talk about the genesis of this idea. And if you go back and listen to one of our early episodes, you can hear Tony talking about the history of Atari. And one of the people who did very well in Atari was a man named Nolan Bushnell. Now, Nolan Bushnell was successful in Atari. He got out before it crashed, or at least made enough money so the crash didn't hurt him too bad. Went on to found Chuck E. Cheese. And
I thought Chuck E. Cheese was older than that.
It is not. 70s, man. Animatronics is the wave of the future.
Yeah, it's been part of my life the whole time, so I guess I just assumed it was like a 50s holdout.
Nolan Bushnell has his finger on the pulse of the youth of America, all right? He's created the video game revolution. He's created the animatronics revolution. Eventually these things will come together and become Five Nights at Freddy's. But he's got to create something new. He has to keep moving forward with his creative juices, and he's not ever quite left the video game scene behind in his heart. In his heart, he's always wanted to try something new and to push the boundaries of that a little bit farther. And so, as an offshoot of his Chuck E. Cheese corporation, he founds a company called Axlon. And Axlon was created to develop a new video game console codenamed Nemo. Now, Nemo was a special and new idea that someone had brought to Bushnell and Axlon, and this idea was based around VHS. All right, up until this point, all of your video games had come on cartridges, right? Because they were very fast to access. You could have a reasonable amount of information on them for a given value of reasonable, obviously, at the time. But Nemo would allow something new in video games. It was inspired by games like Dragon's Lair that used pre-animated footage recorded on a Laserdisc. And the way this would work is that you would have 4 different tracks of video running alongside each other on a VHS. And you would play the game by switching between the different video feeds on the VHS tape.
It's an interesting way of doing it, especially because tapes can hold so much more than the cartridges back then.
Exactly. The information capacity of a tape was massive. It would be less interactive in the same way that those old Dragon's Lair type games were less interactive, but you could blow people's minds with the graphics here. And so Axlon begins building this console that would run on VHS tapes, which is possibly the most 80s thing I've ever said. Eventually, they renamed the console from Nemo, which stood for Never Ever Mention Outside, to the Control Vision. And they start pitching this to Hasbro, because what they realize is, first off, this is going to be a major undertaking. They're creating a whole new video game console in a world that already has quite a few well-regarded video game consoles and had more on the way. They needed a partner.
They must not have seen what was coming, where almost every major toy company tried to put out a console at the same time, and retailers just hated it.
Well, Hasbro listened, at least. And you gotta think, Hasbro is coming off of a great marriage of toys and video, right? They've put their best-selling toys on TV. The Transformers taken over TV. I think also My Little Pony, I believe a Hasbro property, also doing decent business on TV. Hasbro has done pretty well for themselves at this point, having videos and toys put together. It would seem like that a gaming system that puts video and toy together would also be just a slam dunk.
And a lot of people are really familiar with the hardware anyway with tapes, so it's less intimidating than some of the other consoles that were coming out.
Correct. Now, before we go too much further, it's important to understand the kind of video game that you could play on the Control Vision. And the best way to describe this is to tell you about the prototype game that they created to pitch this. It was about 5 minutes long, and the game was called Scene of the Crime. And the essential idea was you were tasked with looking at various camera feeds going on in this rich guy's house and trying to figure out who had stolen the stuff from his safe. So you would get vital information from one feed at one point and then need to switch to another feed at another point, and using contextual clues swap around between these things and then eventually hopefully get the information that you need. But even as cheesy as this idea sounds, this Scene of the Crime thing is the first video game ever to use live action video, right? There's no other video games before this that have been able to do this at this kind of quality. And so you can see why Hasbro would be excited about this. And they go ahead with the subject of today's episode, ostensibly, Tony. They're going to put together a game, and the first game that they're going to make for this new console, they haven't named it officially yet, but codename Control Vision, previous codename Nemo, Night Trap. They're going to make Night Trap. Night Trap was originally conceived as a game where killer ninjas break into a billionaire's house, and it was the player's responsibility to use his state-of-the-art security system to stop these guys from killing the gaggle of college girls who were partying there. However, Hasbro had some objections to this idea. Ninja violence, they argued, was imitatable violence. And as a toy company in the 80s, they were very sensitive to this idea of imitatable violence. This is not something that I was aware of until my adulthood when I watched Phineas and Ferb, and there's an episode where Perry the Platypus is going to hit Dr. Doofenshmirtz with a newspaper, and Doofenshmirtz stops him and says, Perry, can't do that. It's imitatable.
So just calling out their own production companies for it?
Yes, the idea is that if children can see something and do it themselves, you put the kibosh on that. You don't want your characters and your videos punching each other, because then kids might decide to punch each other.
Yeah, but they did that in Transformers a lot.
But those were robots.
Yeah, but you can pretend to be Optimus Prime and punch your little brother in the face.
Hasbro mandated some changes, okay? And they said, listen, we can kind of keep the ninjas idea, but what if they're not ninjas, but they're vampires? And, okay, yes, vampires. We know that vampires normally bite people, but again, biting is imitatable. So these vampires don't have any teeth. And if they move too fast, that's going to be a problem for the production of the game, so they're sick vampires.
Ooh,
and these these sickly vampires with no teeth are going to extract blood, because they're vampires, by clamping this machine around their victims' necks, drilling a needle into their veins, and sucking the blood out.
I mean, that sounds repeatable to me.
No, it sounds horrifying. But children don't have a blood-sucking neck collar sitting around their house.
I mean, just give me some wood and a straw and I'll make it.
This was what they needed, Tony. They decided that despite the fact that they had made this a much more horrifying prospect, right? And I've seen this. Granted, I'm somewhat jaded. I've seen some pretty, unsettling stuff in some pretty unsettling movies. But it is a neck clamp that drills into the side of your neck to suck all of your blood out. That's a little bit more unsettling than just some ninjas sneaking in and karate chopping some people to death, in my mind.
Yeah. That's a little more disturbing.
And they called these vampires the Augurs, which I think was a very cool name. One of the few cool things about Night Trap was the name
with
of
that
these
device,
monsters.
it kind of makes sense.
Yep.
So what's the problem so far?
Nothing really yet. I mean, despite the fact that there's some executive meddling here, Night Trap continues on into production largely as conceived by its creator, James Riley, who was sort of in charge of this whole project. And he goes and starts shooting this script that they've created for this sort of simultaneously occurring video game. And it was really interesting. I got to watch a documentary about the making of Night Trap and sort of the history of the game. And one of the things he talked about was the logistical challenges of shooting this thing so that all of the tracks lined up, because you had to, for instance, if someone exited a room at 18 seconds into the track, they then had to enter the next room that the player could switch to at exactly 18 seconds into the track, and they weren't being filmed simultaneously, so you had to keep an exact record of exactly when everything was going to happen, in addition to having a script for all of the different things that were happening simultaneously, not just what you would show in a single playthrough.
Sounds like it could be tedious, but kind of cool.
It was kind of cool. They initially wanted to do this as a film noir style thing, very dark lighting, but then somebody very smartly pointed out that they didn't know exactly what kind of technology they were going to release this on, and a lot of computers at the time, pixelated graphics would just make dark stuff look completely black. So instead of film noir, everything was lit very brightly with fluorescent lights. And the director of photography on this project was none other than cinematographer Don Burgess, who would go on to be nominated for an Oscar for his work in Forrest Gump. As Night Trap went into production, though, Hasbro started to get nervous. They signed on to this project thinking they were going to be making this video game console, but the further they got into Night Trap and some of these other games that they had planned for the console, they started to realize that they were really being asked to become a movie studio. And that was beyond the scope of what they were interested in doing, despite their later turn of events with licensing their products for movies. They didn't want to be in the production business. So they pulled out of the deal to make the Control Vision shortly after the shooting had been completed, leaving Night Trap without a console.
That sounds like instant death to any video game.
It is, especially considering the fact that Night Trap is special, right? It's not like you can just go to Nintendo and say, well, they pulled out of this. Do you guys want this full motion video footage that we shot to put on your NES with the cartridge? Because it's not going to work. So it seems like Night Trap is dead in the water because nobody's producing a console that can hold this kind of content. The VHS thing, sadly, does not come to fruition. There are some other consoles that kinda do have a VHS video game-esque thing, but nothing as sophisticated as what the Control Vision was supposed to be. And so Night Trap languishes until a new contender emerges, Tony. And this is Sega and the Sega CD. Now, again, you have to put yourself in the late 80s to understand how revolutionary this stuff was at the time. We're talking about a time when floppy disks held 1.44 megabytes of data, and entire computers' hard drives would routinely ship with less than a gigabyte of storage.
I remember those days.
So CD-ROMs come on the scene, and they have a whopping 800 megabytes of storage. And this is the new wave of the future, because now you can fit videos on one of these incredibly compact discs. And Night Trap suddenly has a new lease on life. There's suddenly a way for this game to be released. And so the producers of Night Trap go to Sega CD and they say, hey, listen, You've got this new thing that you're coming out with. We've got a game that's a perfect fit for you. It's called Night Trap. Let's do this. And Sega CD says, all right, yeah, you guys come on over. And they port the game to the Sega CD. Now, it does have to be compressed. Even on a CD, this footage had to be squished way down from what it originally would have been able to be on a VHS. But they put it on the CD. They managed to make it all fit. And on October 15th, 1992, 5 years after the footage was initially filmed, Night Trap was released on the Sega CD.
It's a long time coming, but at least it found its home.
And initially, the reviews skewed mostly negative. The full motion video elements were praised as revolutionary, but the gameplay elements just did not pass muster. It was essentially prey to most of the other problems that full motion video games had, and people just weren't interested in that kind of thing. It was sort of the worst of both worlds between movies and games, where you had bad acting and bad lighting, and you couldn't hardly see the movie because it was so pixelated. And then on top of that, the gameplay was incredibly stilted. You were essentially just waiting for the vampires to walk over a pressure plate so you could push a button and send them down into the trap. And that just didn't make for compelling enough gaming. And Night Trap, at this point, is on the road to being mostly forgotten about by history until December 9th, 1993.
What happens then?
Well, the Senate of the United States of America decides that they need to talk about video games, Tony. And they're not going to talk about the amazing capacity that they have to teach or how they can widen people's minds or expand people's experiences. No. They're very, very, very concerned about the effect that the violence in these games is having on the youth of America. And so they call up two examples. I bet you can guess what the first example is in 1993.
Mortal Kombat.
Mortal Kombat! And for understandable reasons, you could understand a world that had not seen this kind of thing before might be understandably disturbed by people ripping each other's spines out and stabbing each other to death with them.
I mean, like, it's hard for me to not say that they might have a point there. I know that video game violence really isn't near as bad as what they say it is. But in 1993, new territory, every time you punch, an entire gush of blood comes out, and animalities where they eat each other, like, it was pretty gruesome.
I'm not arguing for the point, but I am saying when you're experiencing this for the first time, and especially you're a concerned parent, like you probably don't play these games, but you see them and you just sort of walk past and you see this awful, awful violence happening, you know, in your mind, in the sort of early 1990s mind, in incredible detail, despite the fact that they were still very, very limited compared to what we have today, you would have some concerns. And the other game that they bring up is Night Trap. Night Trap is particularly offensive to these guys because in their minds it promotes violence against women, because they've kept the theme from before of all these sorority girls who are partying at this mansion that were going to be attacked by the ninjas. Now they've just changed it to being attacked by vampires, but essentially you have all of these party girls running around being grabbed by ninjas. And in one particular scene, there's a girl who's in her nightgown, and then she's attacked by this ninja guy with a machine that drives a needle into her neck. You can understand where if you just take that and just that one scene and play it on loop for people for about 8 hours, they might start to say, yeah, I think we might have a problem here with video game violence. Now, Sega does something really smart here in response to this. Immediately following this congressional hearing, they create the Video Game Rating Council. And the Video Game Rating Council was just what it sounds like. They would look at all of the Sega video games, they would rate them, and they would put the rating on the box. So you'd have general audiences, you would have mature for players over 13, and you would have mature for players over 17. And Night Trap got slapped with the highest rating possible, mature for players over 17.
Yeah, so like almost like the NC-17 rating in a movie theater. So Sega's being proactive about it.
And eventually, the Video Game Rating Council would be replaced with the Entertainment Software Rating Board, the ESRB, which was an industry-wide standard, not just for Sega games. However, there was another consequence to the Senate bringing up Night Trap and talking about how terrible it was and calling all the news outlets and telling them about how terrible Night Trap was. And it was that Night Trap sales went through the roof.
Yep, that's what I was anticipating. I just knew that was coming. It's like, oh, we're not going to pull this game until the last second whenever we clear out these warehouses where we've just produced a whole bunch more of them.
And in true human form, when you hear about this horrible, horrible game with sexy ladies being stalked by vampires, you have to know exactly what you're being mad about, Tony. Yep. You can't object to these things without having played them, really. I mean, the Senate did. They never played any of the games, but you really have to understand what your children are getting into. And so, Night Trap sold out for a little bit there. And it goes on with a reasonable amount of notoriety beyond this point, and it gets released on several other video game consoles. The graphics get a little bit better as they go on because newer video game consoles are able to support better compression methods and larger files and things like that. So by the time Night Trap is released on DOS, it's still pretty garbagey compared to today's standard, but it's looking much, much better than it did on the Sega CD. And that should have been the end of the story. Night Trap, full motion video game from back in the day. We're not really into full motion video games anymore, so let's just let it die, right? But no, Kickstarter.
It's back?
In 2014, the Night Trap team puts together a Kickstarter. And they show off the original master footage that they have of the game. And they put out the call to the people and say, we need to remake Night Trap. We need Night Trap in beautiful, high definition. It fizzles.
Oh,
it gets
it.
Some initial excitement, but they don't reach their goal. They don't get to the $200,000 they're looking for to put this out there. So Night Trap, the dream is dead. Except now there's this idea out there. Night Trap in high definition. So in 2016, a programmer named Tyler Hogle is between jobs. He's been working on some similar games from the era, and one of his friends recommends to him, hey, why don't you throw together Night Trap? You can do this in like a week. You're not doing anything else. Put it out anonymously. Put out some footage of what you've done. Make a Night Trap mobile game and see if we can generate some excitement for this idea. And Tyler Hogle says, yeah, okay. And he does exactly that. He strips the footage from the original game somehow. He doesn't have the HD footage himself, but he is able to recreate the code essentially from just looking at where you need to push the buttons to make things happen. And he releases this footage of Night Trap, the mobile game, and people get all excited. And eventually this gets back to James Riley, the guy who originally conceived of and helped film Night Trap. And Riley gets in touch with Tyler Hogle and says, hey, you made this? Here's this HD master footage that I have. Now, I have to pop everybody's bubble here. Night Trap was shot on 35mm film. We don't know where that film is.
No full-on 4K remaster Phantasm style.
Not yet. Maybe one day, Tony. We don't know if the story is fully told. But as of right now, Night Trap is being released on current generation consoles. including the Nintendo Switch.
Wow. That's a little violent for Nintendo.
You'd think... Here's why this is even more delicious than you imagine, Tony. In the aftermath of this Senate campaign against Night Trap, the Nintendo CEO of America stands up and says, excuse me, guys, we will never have Night Trap on one of our consoles because it does not meet our requirements. And he makes it sound like this real moral high ground thing. It turns out what he meant was they couldn't fit the footage on their consoles. It just didn't work. And he couldn't imagine a world where that would be possible. But he sort of takes a stand and makes Nintendo look like the white knights in this. And they had also done things like removing the blood from Mortal Kombat when it was released on the SNES. So Nintendo is kind of trying to take the high road with parents here at the time. And yet, here we are, 2018, Night Trap being released on a Nintendo system.
What a long and curving story.
You know what the best part is?
What's that?
On this release, got a T rating. Rated T for teen.
Oh, how times have changed.
None of that mature nonsense anymore.
Well, I mean, you've got games with full-on frontal nudity and things like that all over the place now, so they've kind of raised the bar.
Not that many games with frontal nudity in them, Tony. I don't know what you're playing.
Grand Theft Auto has it. You can go up to that one camp and it's just dongs as far as the eye can see.
There is cross-dressing in Zelda Breath of the Wild, though, so watch out for that, guys.
Yeah, get that full-on MA rating in some parts of the country.
You do have to do it, too. It's a requirement to beat the game, as far as I can tell.
It's also a requirement to defeat the Huns.
Well, that'll do it for this week, folks. Thank you so much for listening. If you like this, don't forget to tell a friend about it. Subscribe to this podcast on whatever service you're listening to it on, and check us out on Patreon. Patreon.com/Human Echoes is where you can help us make more of these shows.
If you're listening to this on YouTube, you can download it as a podcast. And if you're listening to it on the podcast app, you can watch it on YouTube. We have a ton of other videos. So check out youtube.com/Human Echoes.
Also, if you have bad ideas of your own, you can send them in to badideasshow@gmail.com. Send them into our Twitter @Human Echoes, or comment on the YouTube channel if you're over there.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, guys. We'll see you next week. Hey guys, thanks for watching our video. If you like the things that we make, you should consider becoming a patron over on patreon.com. There should be a link up on your screen right now or in the description of this video. Click it, go to Patreon, and help us make awesome stuff.